Hey, movie nerds! Today, we're stepping into Tulsa King, a 2022 crime drama that explores reinvention, power, and the strange irony of starting life over when most men are thinking about slowing down. A story that asks us to look deeper, to question, and to feel beyond the surface. I'm glad you're here, because together we'll unravel the hidden layers, the subtle details, and the little moments that whisper the heart of the film. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep exploring these stories that shape how we see the world. Now, settle in, open your mind, and let's dive into the depths of this cinematic journey. The story begins not with the fresh-faced hunger of a young man entering crime, but with the weary strength of an older one stepping back into a world that has moved on without him. It is a fascinating inversion of what we usually see in mob stories. Here, the protagonist isn't climbing his way to the top of a hierarchy. Instead, he's been cast out, exiled, and told to rebuild from ashes, almost like a biblical wanderer sent into the desert with nothing but his instincts. That alone sets the tone for something different. This isn't the bright neon of New York or the glamorous blood-soaked ballrooms of Las Vegas. This is the heartland, where cowboys once ruled, where wide skies and long stretches of land clash against the cramped codes of organized crime. The juxtaposition is striking, and it gives the narrative its unique rhythm, a gangster dropped in a place that doesn't know what to do with him. What's striking about this tale is how it explores the idea of displacement. Imagine giving your life, decades of it, to a cause, a family, a code, and then, at the end of that loyalty, being discarded like a relic. That's the emotional engine of this story. Our central figure, after serving 25 years in prison, is sent far from the familiar streets of New York to set up shop in Oklahoma. This isn't a reward, it's punishment disguised as opportunity, a way of getting him out of the way without dirtying the family's hands. And so he lands in a city with no mob infrastructure, no allies, no history, and must carve out an empire from dust and stubbornness. From here, the narrative unfolds like an old-school western blended with a modern crime saga. Our protagonist, carrying both old codes of honor and the scars of betrayal, steps into this new world and begins to test its boundaries. He is like an alien in Tulsa, bewildered by technology, by culture, even by simple things like cashless payment systems and legalized marijuana dispensaries. These details are more than comic relief. They highlight the passage of time, the cost of loyalty, the way the world refuses to wait for anyone. And yet, his disorientation is balanced by his old instincts. Though he may fumble with cell phones, his ability to read people, to assess power dynamics, to bend others to his will, remains razor sharp. What excites the story is the collision between his old-world mob mentality and the unexpected players he encounters. He builds a crew not from hardened wise guys but from misfits, outsiders, people who barely understand what they're signing up for. A cab driver, a weed dealer, a handful of locals who see both opportunity and danger in this older man's shadow. These unlikely partnerships give the narrative both humor and heart. Watching him try to graft the traditions of the mafia onto the soil of Oklahoma is both absurd and compelling. The tension between old codes and new landscapes becomes the central drama. Can the ways of Cosa Nostra survive in a place where horses outnumber syndicates? But beneath the humor lies the deeper theme of legacy. What does it mean to spend a life in service of something that ultimately betrays you? Our protagonist is forced to confront not only the men in front of him but the ghosts behind him, the years wasted, the family estranged, the youth lost in prison cells. These questions haunt him, and they give the narrative its emotional backbone. The moments where he sits in quiet reflection, staring out at landscapes unfamiliar to him, resonate as much as the violent confrontations. He is a man seeking to define himself not just as a gangster but as a human being, someone who has one last chance to build something that matters. The plot itself moves with an unpredictable rhythm, mixing slow-burn character moments with sudden bursts of violence. At first, the older man appears to be winning. His charisma and ruthlessness allow him to carve out control of small-time operations, to intimidate competitors, to demand respect. But the deeper he digs into this new empire, the more enemies he uncovers. It's not just rival gangs or the suspicion of locals, it's the larger forces of modern crime, far more sophisticated and ruthless than what he remembers. What begins as a story of rebuilding quickly shifts into a story of survival, as he realizes he is not only out of place but perhaps out of time. One of the most exciting threads involves his clashes with modern criminal organizations. Groups that don't play by the same codes of honor, that don't recognize loyalty or tradition, that see him as fossil. These confrontations highlight the film's central conflict, the old guard versus the new, respect versus profit, tradition versus efficiency. His strategies, drawn from decades-old playbooks, sometimes give him the upper hand, but they also make him vulnerable. There's a constant question hanging over the narrative. Can a man defined by the past survive in a world that no longer values it? Twists emerge not only in the criminal battles but in his personal life. Estranged family members resurface, forcing him to confront the consequences of his choices. Relationships form in unexpected places, tinged with both tenderness and danger. Allies betray him, enemies surprise him with loyalty, and the line between friend and foe blurs constantly. The narrative thrives on these reversals, reminding us that in the world of organized crime, and perhaps in life itself, certainty is illusion. The story builds toward its climax, the stakes rise beyond money or territory. It becomes a question of identity. Who is this man, really? Is he simply the loyal soldier discarded by his family? Is he the outsider trying to build an empire in strange soil? Or is he something more, someone who, even in twilight years, can redefine himself, can seize dignity from betrayal, can claim a new kind of power? These questions drive the final acts, and they keep the story from being mere crime drama. They elevate it into reflection on legacy, mortality, and reinvention. The key elements teased throughout, the clashes with rival gangs, the betrayals from within, the strain of old loyalties against new possibilities, all converge in ways that feel both inevitable and surprising. Violence erupts, but it is never without weight. Blood spilled in the story always carries consequence, always asks the viewer to consider what it costs to live a life defined by power. And yet, even amid the brutality, there are moments of levity, of humanity, of humor found in the absurdity of an older gangster trying to navigate apps and technology while teaching small-time criminals about respect. These tonal shifts make the narrative unpredictable, balancing darkness with charm, menace with warmth. By the end, we are left not with a clean resolution but with questions that linger. What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to start over when the world has already judged you finished? What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to start over when the world has already judged you finished? Can loyalty survive betrayal? Can dignity be rebuilt from ruins? These questions echo long after the credits roll, and they are the true gift of the story. Because while the gunfights and power plays thrill in the moment, it is the silence after them, the image of a man staring at wide skies, haunted but unbroken, that stays with us. And so, as we leave this exploration, the twists still echoing in our minds, we recognize that this isn't just a crime drama. It is a meditation on time, on loyalty, on the strange possibility of rebirth. It asks us not just to watch but to reflect, not just to thrill at violence but to consider its cost. It is about power, yes, but also about the fragile humanity behind it. And that is why it lingers, why it matters, why it deserves our attention as more than entertainment but as literature in motion. This has been a journey into displacement, legacy, and survival, into the ways an old code collides with a new world, into the soul of a man trying to rewrite his final chapter. And while we've only teased the key turns and reversals, the heart of the story beats strongest in those quiet moments when we recognize ourselves, not as gangsters, but as humans struggling against time, betrayal, and the search for belonging. The story begins in shadows, not in the bustling streets of New York where men in sharp suits and polished shoes once ruled, but in the hollowed quiet of a prison cell. Years have carved lines into the face of a man who once commanded respect with nothing more than a nod. 25 years, that is how long the world has moved on without him. He carries the weight of those years not just in his age, but in the silence he's learned to cultivate, the stillness that makes him seem like stone. And yet, when the cell doors open and daylight pours in, there is the faint flicker of something else, possibility. Freedom, but also exile. For in this world, freedom doesn't come with a parade. It comes with a warning, a dismissal, a cold hand brushing you aside. The first scenes breathe with irony. He is released, but not restored. The family, the organization to which he gave his loyalty and his youth, does not welcome him back. Instead, they send him away, far from the familiar city blocks that once echoed with his footsteps. The decision is delivered like a casual insult. Go to Tulsa. Set up business there. His eyes narrow at the absurdity. Tulsa, a city that has nothing to do with the codes and rituals of the Cosa Nostra. This is not opportunity. This is banishment dressed as a mission. He is meant to fade out, to occupy himself with scraps. But he does not fight the order. He nods, with the quiet dignity of a man who has already learned what betrayal feels like. He packs his bags, not with excitement but with resolve. If Tulsa is what they've given him, Tulsa is what he'll take. The arrival is both comic and tragic. He steps off the plane into a place that doesn't know him, doesn't fear him, doesn't care who he is. The streets are wide, the sky's endless, and the rhythm of life is slower than the humming pulse of New York. He wears his tailored suits, his old-world mannerisms, and he stands out immediately, like a piece of another time transplanted into soil that doesn't know how to nourish it. This is where the first real tension blooms, not in violence, but in displacement. He is a lion, but the savannah has been replaced with prairie. Still, he moves through the city with watchful eyes, testing it, measuring its weaknesses. One of his earliest encounters is both absurd and telling. A taxi driver offers him a ride, and in the casual chatter of the drive, the older man begins to probe. He asks questions not out of small talk but out of instinct, reading the driver the way he once read rival soldiers. What begins as a simple ride turns into the seed of an alliance. The driver, ordinary and unambitious, finds himself drawn into orbit of this stranger who carries himself with such certainty. By the end of the ride, the older man has already decided, this one will be useful. In that decision lies the first glimpse of how he will build his empire, not from soldiers groomed in the traditions of the mob, but from ordinary people willing to be reshaped by his will. The true turning point in these early days comes when he stumbles upon the marijuana dispensary. To him, the idea of selling drugs openly, in the light of day, is almost laughable. He cannot believe his eyes, the counter lined with glass jars, the customers casually shopping as if they were buying bread. But what strikes him more than the novelty is the vulnerability. This, he decides, is the first piece of his empire. He walks in, calmly, and speaks to the young man behind the counter. At first, the encounter feels almost paternal, an older man offering advice. But then his voice shifts, the steel slides into it, and suddenly the scene transforms into extortion. He tells the dispensary owner that from this day forward, he owes him protection. The young man laughs, at first thinking it's a joke. But when he sees the seriousness in the stranger's eyes, when he realizes that this is no ordinary old man but someone who carries violence like second skin, the laughter dies. The dispensary becomes his first foothold. From here, the story begins to build momentum. He gathers more people into his circle, not with promises of wealth but with the magnetism of his certainty. He is old, yes, but he radiates the kind of authority that can't be faked. A handful of locals, intrigued and intimidated, begin to orbit him. Some are reckless, others simply desperate for guidance, but all are bound by his presence. Slowly, without ceremony, a crew forms. They are ragtag, untrained, even comical at times in their lack of discipline, but he molds them patiently. For him, loyalty is more important than polish. As he builds outward, the city begins to push back. Tulsa is not as empty as it first appears. There are already players here, small-time criminals, biker gangs, rival operators who don't take kindly to a stranger muscling into their territory. The first clashes are subtle, a warning here, a shove there. But beneath them, tension simmers. The older man, however, refuses to be intimidated. He confronts threats with calm that unnerves even hardened men. He does not need to shout. He simply states what will happen, and the certainty in his tone makes others believe him. This, too, is part of his genius, the ability to bend reality with nothing more than conviction. The narrative, however, is not built solely on crime. The personal shadows begin to emerge. He carries the weight of a estranged family, of a daughter who grew up without him, of years lost to a cell. News of her life, glimpses of what he missed, stab deeper than any knife. His attempts to reconnect are awkward, halting, often rebuffed. But those attempts reveal the heart of the story. This is not just a man trying to build an empire. It is a man trying to build meaning, to reclaim fragments of what was taken. The emotional stakes grow heavier as these personal threads intertwine with his criminal pursuits. Meanwhile, his relationship with the cab driver deepens. What began as convenience transforms into something resembling mentorship. He teaches the younger man not just how to survive but how to think, how to see power in every interaction. These lessons, delivered in the quiet drawl of a man who has lived them, carry weight. They are not just about crime, they are about survival, dignity, legacy. And yet, beneath this bond lies danger, for mentorship in this world always comes with a price. As the first half unfolds, the tone oscillates between comedy, violence, and quiet reflection. There are scenes of him fumbling with modern technology, smartphones, apps, credit cards, that bring laughter. But there are also scenes of sudden brutality, moments where his patience snaps and his old instincts surface with terrifying precision. These juxtapositions remind us constantly who he is, a man straddling two worlds, both dangerous and absurd. The forces opposing him grow clearer as the story progresses. Rival groups begin to notice his presence, and whispers spread of the old man in the suit who walks into businesses and takes what he wants. Some underestimate him, dismissing him as relic. Others see him as threat. Slowly, a web of conflict begins to form, threads pulling tighter with each move he makes. Yet through it all, he remains steady. He walks through Tulsa as if he owns it already, even though his empire consists of little more than a dispensary and a handful of misfits. It is his confidence, his refusal to bow, that unsettles enemies more than his actions. He embodies inevitability, as though the city itself has no choice but to bend to him. By the time the first half reaches its crescendo, the foundations have been laid. He has his foothold in the dispensary, his small but growing crew, his mentorship of the cab driver, his attempts to reconnect with estranged family. He has drawn the attention of rivals, set in motion conflicts that will soon ignite. And yet, the true tension is not in what he has gained but in what he has yet to face. The shadows of betrayal still linger. The city still hides threats. The past still haunts him. What makes these early chapters so compelling is the sense of inevitability combined with fragility. We know he will rise, but we also sense he could fall at any moment. Every small victory is laced with danger. Every laugh at his old-fashioned ways is followed by a reminder of his ruthless efficiency. This is the rhythm of the story. Old world colliding with new, comedy colliding with menace, loyalty colliding with betrayal. And so the stage is set. The city, once indifferent, now knows his name. The locals, once bemused, now respect and fear him. The rivals, once dismissive, now prepare to strike. He stands at the edge of empire, not yet built but already imagined, with one foot planted in loyalty and the other in reinvention. The story has only begun, but already it pulses with the tension of past and future colliding in the present moment. The pulse of the story quickens as the threads of loyalty, betrayal, and ambition tighten around the older man who has carved his unlikely empire in strange soil. The beginning was about establishing a foothold, about proving he was not a relic left behind by the world. But now the battles sharpen, the lines harden, and the choices he makes will determine not only the survival of his operation but the survival of himself as a man. The first waves of tension come from within, not without. The makeshift crew he has assembled, for all their loyalty, are still untested, and cracks begin to show in their discipline. The cab driver who once looked at him with awe now hesitates, questioning whether the path he is being guided down is salvation or destruction. These doubts surface not as betrayal but as trembling in loyalty, the kind of hesitation that can topple an empire built on fragile foundations. The older man senses this, and his response is telling. He does not rage, does not threaten. Instead, he doubles down on mentorship, reminding the young man of dignity, of strength, of why following him is not merely about profit but about honor. His speeches land with a mix of menace and tenderness, binding his followers more tightly even as the cracks widen. But the greater threats loom outside. Rival factions, once content to watch him as curiosity, now recognize him as danger. The dispensary, once dismissed as minor operation, has become symbol of his reach. It is no longer a business, it is a flag planted in enemy territory, a signal that he is building something lasting. And so the attacks begin. First, it is subtle sabotage, whispers in the dark, intimidation of those who support him. Then it escalates into overt aggression. Windows smashed, trucks intercepted, warnings delivered with fists and knives. Tulsa, once a city bemused by his presence, now vibrates with tension. The older man does not flinch. He has seen too much, survived too much, to be rattled by intimidation. Instead, he leans into the conflict, responding not with volume but with precision. He strikes back swiftly, decisively, leaving no doubt that he will not be pushed aside. His enemies expect bluster, instead they find calculation. He dismantles threats piece by piece, not through sheer force but through strategy born of decades in the shadows of New York's most ruthless. This is where the story finds its rhythm, violence as chess, every move calculated, every response measured. Yet the battles of the street are not the only ones he fights. The most devastating blows come from betrayal. Whispers reach him that the very family that exiled him is watching closely, not with interest but with suspicion. The mission to Tulsa was never meant to empower him, it was meant to sideline him, to bury him quietly. But his unexpected rise unsettles them. Suddenly, he is not forgotten soldier but potential threat. The man they tried to discard has become reminder of their own fragility, their own inability to control him. And so the betrayal deepens. Messages arrive, coded but clear. His successes are not welcome, his survival is not desired. The men he once called brothers now move to erase him completely. This revelation cracks something inside him. It is one thing to be banished, it is another to be targeted by those he once gave his life to. The family that defined his existence now seeks his end. His reflections grow heavier, quieter. In the stillness of Tulsa nights, staring at skies too wide and stars too many, he contemplates the meaning of it all. What is loyalty, if this is its reward? What is legacy, if it is to be erased by those who should honor it? These questions haunt him as deeply as any bullet could wound. The emotional weight intensifies as his estranged family re-enters his life. His daughter, long distant, confronts him not with forgiveness but with accusation. She speaks of years lost, of a father absent while she grew, of wounds no empire can heal. She speaks of years lost, of a father absent while she grew, of wounds no empire can heal. Their encounters are not melodramatic reunions but jagged confrontations, filled with silences more cutting than words. He longs to bridge the gap, but he does not know how. Crime taught him power, not tenderness. And so he stumbles, offering gifts where apologies are needed, offering protection where vulnerability is required. These moments deepen the story, reminding us that his battles are not only with enemies but with himself, with the man he has become. Meanwhile, the cab driver, his protégé, faces his own test. Drawn deeper into the world of crime, he begins to lose sight of who he once was. The money, the power, the thrill, all intoxicate him. But he also sees the cost. The violence unsettles him, the danger weighs heavy. At one point, he considers walking away. The older man confronts him, not with threats but with clarity. He reminds him that life always extracts its price, that dignity is not found in avoiding battles but in how one fights them. The mentorship hardens into something more complex, not father and son, not master and student, but companions in a dangerous dance neither can escape. The conflicts reach boiling point when rival gangs strike openly. The attacks are no longer whispers, they are wars. The dispensary is targeted, his crew threatened, his alliances tested. The city becomes battleground, and the man at its center must navigate not only violence but betrayal. It is here that his old instincts blaze brightest. He orchestrates counterstrikes with ruthless precision, dismantling rivals in ways they do not expect. Yet each victory carries cost, blood spilled, trust frayed, shadows deepened. The story twists further when one of his own betrays him. A member of his makeshift crew, tempted by promises of wealth and power from rivals, turns against him. The betrayal cuts deeper than bullets. For him, loyalty is the highest code, the sacred bond. To be betrayed by one he nurtured is to be wounded in soul. His response is swift, brutal, but also tinged with sorrow. The traitor is punished, but the wound remains. This moment crystallizes the theme. In a world built on loyalty, betrayal is the only inevitability. As the climax nears, all threads converge. The family in New York moves decisively against him, sending men to eliminate him once and for all. The rivals in Tulsa, emboldened by whispers of his vulnerability, strike with renewed fury. His estranged daughter faces him, forcing him to confront not only enemies but the father he failed to be. And his protégé, torn between loyalty and fear, must decide whether to stand with him or walk away. The final confrontations are both violent and poetic. In one sequence, the older man, surrounded and outnumbered, dismantles his enemies with the cold efficiency of someone who has lived too long in shadows. The violence is swift, brutal, unflinching. Yet it is not spectacle, it is inevitability. Each strike is not triumph but burden, another reminder of the life he cannot escape. When the dust settles, he stands alone, surrounded by bodies and silence, the cost of survival etched into every line of his face. But the resolution does not come in gunfire alone. The true climax is quieter. It is the confrontation with his daughter, the conversation where he lays bare his failures, where he admits that loyalty to the mob stole his loyalty to her. There are no easy reconciliations, no perfect endings. She does not embrace him, does not forgive with a smile. But there is a flicker of recognition, a crack in the wall. Perhaps not forgiveness, but the beginning of possibility. For him, this is victory greater than any territory claimed. The protégé, too, makes his choice. Standing at the edge of escape, he looks at the man who shaped him and realizes he cannot walk away. Loyalty, fragile and fractured, holds. Together, they face the uncertain future, not as master and servant but as companions, bound by blood spilled and trust tested. The final images linger. The older man sits alone, watching the horizon, the wide skies of Oklahoma stretching endlessly. He has built something, yes, but he has also lost much. He has survived, but survival is not triumph. It is endurance. The camera lingers on his face, weary but unbroken, scarred but dignified. The story does not end with neat resolution. It ends with questions, about loyalty, about legacy, about the cost of power. And so the tale concludes not with the roar of guns but with the quiet weight of survival. A man cast aside has carved a place for himself. A relic has proven his relevance. Yet the victories are bittersweet, the future uncertain. It is this ambiguity, this refusal to offer clean closure, that makes the story resonate. Because life, like crime, is never clean. It is messy, fragile, filled with betrayals and brief triumphs, with moments of tenderness buried in violence. The second half of this journey shows us not just the rise of an unlikely empire, but the cost of carrying it. It reveals that power is never free, that loyalty is always fragile, that reinvention carries its own wounds. And in the end, it leaves us with the image of a man both haunted and redeemed, both broken and unyielding, both relic and king. A man who, against all odds, refused to fade quietly into exile, and instead carved his name into the soil of a place that never asked for him, but will never forget him. At the center of this sprawling, unflinching narrative stands one man, shaped by decades of silence, betrayal, and loyalty, whose presence looms so large it bends the story around him. To understand the journey is to first understand him, and then to unravel how those around him orbit, collide, and are transformed in his gravity. Characters in this tale are not flat archetypes, they are flawed, shifting, contradictory human beings. Each carries a piece of the larger story's themes: loyalty, betrayal, reinvention, and survival. To look at them closely is to see the layers beneath the surface, the whispers of humanity hidden in violence and bravado. The protagonist himself is a contradiction made flesh. He is at once lion and relic, feared and dismissed, powerful and wounded. Years in prison did not strip him of his instincts, they sharpened them. He emerges from his sentence not broken, but tempered, like steel that has been forged in fire. Yet the scars remain. His body is older, slower, not as forgiving as before. His eyes carry weight, his silences echo louder than most men's words. In every gesture, there is the sense of someone who has seen too much, survived too much, and is now unwilling to waste words or time. What makes him compelling is not invincibility but fragility. His limp, his disorientation with technology, his awkwardness with a daughter estranged for decades, these are not weaknesses in narrative sense but layers of humanity. They remind us he is not a myth but a man. And yet, when pushed, when violence demands answer, he moves with a precision that terrifies. The brutality is not indulgence, it is inevitability, the language he knows best. At the heart of his characterization is loyalty, both his greatest strength and his deepest wound. For decades he gave everything to an organization, only to be discarded. That betrayal defines his exile in Tulsa, but it also shapes how he builds anew. His loyalty does not vanish, it shifts. He extends it to strangers, to a cab driver, to a dispensary owner, to a makeshift crew of locals who barely understand the world he inhabits. His mentorship of these people is as much about need as it is about instinct. He cannot stop himself from molding others, from imposing his old codes on new soil. But that loyalty is double-edged. It binds people to him, but it also blinds him, leaving him vulnerable to betrayal once again. His arc, then, is not simply one of power, but of wrestling with the meaning of loyalty when the world itself no longer honors it. The cab driver becomes one of the most fascinating satellites in his orbit. Initially, he is simply convenience, a ride, a pair of hands. But soon he evolves into something deeper: protégé, surrogate son, even mirror. Where the older man carries scars of decades, the cab driver is fresh, malleable, still uncertain of who he is or what he wants. Their relationship is not built on sentimentality but on shared necessity. The older man sees in him potential, perhaps even redemption, a chance to shape a new life where his own family ties are broken. For the cab driver, the allure is intoxicating. He is pulled into a world of power, danger, and clarity. The rules may be brutal, but they are simple, unlike the ambiguities of ordinary life. Yet beneath the mentorship lies danger. Every step deeper into the underworld erases a piece of who he was. The conflict for him is not external but internal. Can he remain himself while standing beside a man who bends the world through violence? His hesitations, his doubts, his near betrayals, all reflect the fragility of loyalty, the theme that pulses through the story. Then there is the dispensary owner, the unlikely businessman thrust into criminal orbit against his will. He represents the absurdity of the older man's transplantation to Tulsa. Here is someone whose business is legal, open, protected by modern laws, and yet he finds himself paying tribute to a figure out of the past, a gangster who walks in as if the world still works by his rules. At first, his role seems minor, almost comic relief, the straight man to the older man's outdated codes. But as the story deepens, he too becomes symbol of adaptation. He learns to navigate this imposed hierarchy, to survive by leaning into his new reality. In his awkwardness, his fear, his reluctant loyalty, we see reflected the broader theme of how ordinary people are drawn into systems larger than themselves. The estranged daughter adds the story's deepest wound. Unlike rivals or rivals turned allies, she represents a part of him he cannot control with intimidation or violence. She is the embodiment of consequence, the years lost in prison, the life he sacrificed for loyalty to an organization that betrayed him. Their interactions are jagged, filled with words unsaid, silences heavy with pain. She does not greet him with forgiveness but with accusation, and in her anger lies truth. He cannot undo the years. He cannot erase her childhood without him. In her presence, his codes of honor crumble. He can command a city, intimidate rivals, dismantle enemies, but he cannot easily win back his daughter. This relationship underscores the theme of redemption. It asks whether a man defined by violence and loyalty can also be defined by love, whether his last chapter can be about rebuilding what he lost rather than simply surviving. The rivals he encounters in Tulsa, whether biker gangs or organized factions, serve less as singular antagonists and more as embodiments of the new world he must face. They represent modern criminality, efficient, ruthless, stripped of the old codes of honor. To them, he is fossil. They mock his suits, his rituals, his insistence on respect. But in their underestimation lies his power. They are efficient but shallow, he is slow but deep. Where they think in profit margins, he thinks in legacies. The contrast between them sharpens the theme of old versus new, tradition versus innovation. They are not simply villains, they are reflections of the world that has moved on, the world that no longer values the codes he still clings to. Among these rivals, the most potent are those connected to his past, the family in New York who cast him aside. They are not present in every scene, but their shadow looms over everything. They embody betrayal in its purest form. Their decision to exile him, and later to target him, transforms the story from local turf battle into personal reckoning. For him, they are not just enemies, they are ghosts. Every move he makes is shaped by memory of them, by loyalty given and loyalty betrayed. They remind us that his exile is not only geographical but spiritual. He is man without home, without anchor, and their looming presence forces him to define himself anew. Even the minor characters, the shopkeepers, the villagers, the locals who fall under his influence, play crucial roles in shaping the tapestry of his characterization. They reveal his adaptability, his ability to turn strangers into allies, his knack for reading people with unnerving accuracy. Through them, we see his charisma at work, the magnetism that allows a man out of time to still bend the present. What unites all these characters is the way they reflect fragments of the protagonist himself. The cab driver reflects his past self, malleable and searching. The daughter reflects his losses, the cost of his choices. The dispensary owner reflects the absurdity of his codes in modern context. The rivals reflect the challenge of irrelevance. Together, they create a mosaic of his identity, who he was, who he is, who he could be. The brilliance of this character ensemble lies not in their perfection, but in their contradictions. The protagonist is ruthless yet tender, broken yet unyielding. The cab driver is loyal yet hesitant. The daughter is angry yet still tethered by blood. The rivals are modern yet shallow. Each character carries dualities, and in those dualities lie the themes of the story itself. The narrative insists that no one is one thing alone. The protagonist is both criminal and seeker of redemption. His daughter is both wound and hope. The cab driver is both protege and potential betrayer. Even the rivals, in their cruelty, reveal fear, the fear of irrelevance, the fear of losing power. These contradictions make them human, and their humanity makes the story resonate beyond crime drama. In the end, the characters are not simply players on a stage. They are mirrors, reflecting themes of loyalty, betrayal, reinvention, and survival back to us. The older man at the center is not hero or villain, he is man. The cab driver is not simply sidekick, he is embodiment of choice. The daughter is not simply subplot, she is soul of the story. The rivals are not simply enemies, they are symbols of a changing world. Each, in their way, deepens the meditation on what it means to live, to fight, to belong, to be remembered. And so the character analysis reveals what the plot alone cannot. The humanity beneath the violence, the fragility beneath the power, the longing beneath the loyalty. It shows us that this story, for all its guns and betrayals, is ultimately about people. Flawed, contradictory, fragile, and searching. And so the character analysis reveals what the plot alone cannot. The humanity beneath the violence, the fragility beneath the power, the longing beneath the loyalty. It shows us that this story, for all its guns and betrayals, is ultimately about people. Flawed, contradictory, fragile, and searching. And it is in those contradictions, those fragments of truth, that the story finds its resonance. There is always another story hidden beneath the one projected on the screen, the story of how the film itself came into being. Often, it is stranger, funnier, and more illuminating than the tale being told within the frame. The creation of Tulsa King was no exception. To understand its strange little facts is to peel back the curtain and realize that the production was as unlikely as the narrative itself, a crime saga not made in the back alleys of New York or the bright avenues of Los Angeles, but in the wide-open stretches of Oklahoma, with Sylvester Stallone at the helm of his first television role, and a crew adapting to circumstances as unpredictable as the character at the center of their story. One of the strangest truths about this production is the fact that Stallone himself, after decades of defining big-screen masculinity, had never before anchored a television series. For an actor whose name had been synonymous with Rocky Balboa and John Rambo, the move to streaming television seemed improbable, even jarring. But it happened almost on a whim. Stallone admitted in interviews that he wasn't initially sold on the idea of leading a serialized drama. What convinced him wasn't the money or even the script, it was the allure of the character. He said Dwight was like Michael Corleone meets a cowboy, and the mixture of gangster grit with fish-out-of-water comedy amused him. The strange fact, then, is that Stallone's debut in television, late in his career, was not the polished project of a man seeking legacy, but rather a leap of curiosity, an instinctive gamble. And what a gamble it was, because production was filled with oddities. For instance, though the show is titled Tulsa King and set in Oklahoma, much of it wasn't filmed in Tulsa at all. A great deal of the production was staged in Oklahoma City, with Tulsa used sparingly for key exteriors and landmarks. The reason was logistical. Tulsa's infrastructure and layout made large-scale filming complicated, while Oklahoma City offered more flexibility. Yet the production team went to great lengths to preserve authenticity. Props were brought in from Tulsa businesses, extras were drawn from the local community, and sets were dressed to replicate Tulsa's unique feel. So while audiences saw the streets of Tulsa, they were often walking through Oklahoma City's shadows instead. This trick of geography was a fact that amused locals, who would sometimes spot familiar Oklahoma City storefronts passing off as Tulsa neighborhoods. Perhaps the most bizarre recurring event during filming was the weather. Oklahoma, known for unpredictable climate, lived up to its reputation. Production schedules were derailed by sudden storms, high winds, and temperature swings so extreme that cast and crew had to scramble constantly. One particular incident became legendary. A violent windstorm nearly toppled a lighting rig, forcing the crew to hold it in place by hand while Stallone calmly continued acting through the chaos. Later he joked, "If I can survive Rocky running up those steps, I can survive a little Oklahoma wind." The footage from that day was ruined, but the story became a badge of honor among crew members. Animals also became part of the oddity. Oklahoma has no shortage of strays, and dogs were known to wander into scenes uninvited. In one memorable moment, a stray dog ambled into frame while Stallone was delivering an intense monologue. Instead of breaking character, he bent down, patted the dog on the head, and kept speaking, never missing a beat. The director called cut, but the footage was so natural that they considered leaving it in. Though it didn't make the final cut, that scene was whispered about as evidence of Stallone's ability to improvise through anything. There's also the curious case of the extras. Many locals were cast as background characters, but because the show revolved around organized crime invading Tulsa, the casting team deliberately avoided anyone who looked too stereotypically mob-like. Instead, they hired local ranchers, bartenders, and students to play customers, drivers, and passers-by. The juxtaposition of real Oklahoma locals with the larger-than-life Stallone in his sharp suits created surreal contrasts. Some extras were so in awe of Stallone that they froze on camera, unable to move naturally, forcing multiple retakes. Stallone, amused rather than annoyed, often joked with them between takes, shaking hands and telling stories from his Rocky days. Stranger still was how deeply Stallone embraced the absurdity of his character's situation. He insisted on trying to operate real Oklahoma machinery for authenticity: tractors, pickup trucks, even horses. During one sequence, he attempted to mount a horse for a shot, but the horse, unfamiliar with the chaos of film sets, bolted unexpectedly. Stallone held on for several feet before gracefully letting go, tumbling into the dust. Crew rushed to him in panic, but he stood up laughing, brushing himself off with the same resilience that made Rocky iconic. "Guess the horse didn't like New Yorkers," he quipped. A lesser-known piece of trivia is the show's connection to Taylor Sheridan, the mind behind Yellowstone. Sheridan's creative fingerprints are everywhere: gritty realism, fish-out-of-water storytelling, a fascination with the clash between modern America and old codes of loyalty. Yet Sheridan wasn't heavily involved day-to-day. Instead, his influence was more like a blessing from afar. Stallone himself took liberties with dialogue, often rewriting lines on set to fit his rhythm. He believed the key to Dwight was not just menace but humor. Many of the show's funniest lines, the little quips about technology, about being too old to figure out smartphones, were improvised by Stallone. In fact, directors admitted that nearly 30% of his dialogue came from improvisation, not script. The production also faced peculiar cultural clashes. Tulsa is proud of its identity, and the sudden arrival of a Hollywood crew stirred both excitement and skepticism. Locals watched as Stallone and his entourage swept into diners, gas stations, and small shops, transforming familiar spaces into sets. Some embraced it, happily volunteering stories or offering locations. Others muttered about Hollywood's intrusion. In one case, a diner refused permission to film after its owner declared, "Gangsters don't belong in my cafe." The crew respected the decision, but the irony was thick: a crime story being thwarted not by the law, but by a diner's stubborn owner. Even stranger were the superstitions whispered on set. Locals warned cast and crew about filming near certain historic sites, particularly the Greenwood district, tied to the tragic 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. While the show never explicitly dramatized those events, the presence of that history weighed heavily. Crew members claimed to feel uneasy in certain locations, describing strange chills or equipment malfunctioning inexplicably. Whether coincidence or superstition, these moments lent an eerie atmosphere, as if the ghosts of Tulsa's past were watching. One of the oddest and most endearing stories involved Stallone's relationship with fans. He was mobbed constantly, even in remote Oklahoma towns, by people eager for selfies. But one encounter stood out. A grandmother approached him not to talk about Rocky or Rambo, but to ask if he could help her grandson find a job. Stallone, touched, pulled the young man aside and gave him a brief pep talk about hard work and persistence. Later, the crew quietly hired the grandson as a production assistant. To this day, he credits Stallone with giving him his break in Hollywood. Another trivia nugget: Stallone's suits. His wardrobe was so immaculate, tailored in bold New York styles, that it clashed with Tulsa's laid-back atmosphere. Locals joked that you could spot the production from miles away just by looking for Stallone's pinstripes shimmering under the Oklahoma sun. The wardrobe team imported many of his suits from Italy, tailoring them specifically to highlight the absurdity of a gangster walking through cow country. Stallone himself loved the contrast, saying, "The suits are Dwight's armor. They're how he keeps New York alive inside him." Then there was the marijuana dispensary set, which became a hub of humor. Locals flocked to take photos outside it, not realizing it was fake. Some even tried to buy from it, confusing the actors playing employees. Security had to be posted to redirect curious customers. Stallone, laughing at the absurdity, once joked that if acting ever failed, the crew could make a fortune selling actual weed from the prop shop. Another strange fact is how quickly the show was renewed. Before the first season even finished airing, it had already been greenlit for another. The ratings skyrocketed beyond expectations, making it one of Paramount Plus's biggest hits. This immediate success stunned Stallone, who had originally signed on thinking it would be a small project. He admitted in interviews that he hadn't planned for long-term television work, but the runaway popularity made him reconsider. "Guess I'm not retiring yet," he chuckled. Even more bizarre was the crossover fan reaction. Audiences began speculating about Dwight crossing into the Sheridanverse alongside the Yellowstone characters. Memes circulated online of Dwight sharing whiskey with Rip Wheeler or intimidating cowboys with mob tactics. Though purely fanfiction, the speculation became so intense that executives at Paramount had to clarify no crossover was planned. Perhaps the strangest and most telling fact of all is that Stallone, despite his reputation as tough guy, described filming Tulsa King as one of the most exhausting projects of his life, not because of the fights or stunts, but because of the pace of television. Used to the slow, deliberate process of film, he was stunned by how quickly television moved, how scripts were rewritten on the fly, how scenes had to be shot at breakneck speed. He confessed that it was like going 12 rounds every day. Yet he thrived on it. The exhaustion fueled him, and the fast pace gave the show its raw, unpolished energy. All these strange facts, the Oklahoma storms, the stray dogs, the superstitions, the improvisations, the grandmother asking for a job, paint a picture of a production as unpredictable as the character at its center. What unites them is the sense of displacement, of something out of place yet thriving. Just as Dwight carves an empire in soil that seems alien, so too did Stallone and his crew build a series in a place that wasn't quite ready for them but ultimately embraced them. And that, perhaps, is the strangest truth of all, that this story of exile and reinvention mirrored its own making. A Hollywood icon, far from the glamour of Los Angeles, surrounded by locals, strays, storms, and stubborn diners, created a show that captured hearts across the world. The oddities were not distractions, they were the spirit of the project. They reminded cast and crew that sometimes the strangest circumstances create the most authentic stories. And in that sense, the behind-the-scenes tale of Tulsa King is every bit as compelling, every bit as unlikely, as the narrative told on screen. Every story we watch unfold on the screen has a twin, one that exists in the margins, in the quiet corners of production, in the accidents and oddities that never appear in the final cut but live on in whispers among the cast and crew. With Tulsa King, that twin story is stranger, funnier, and more textured than one might expect. On the surface, this was a crime drama anchored by Sylvester Stallone, an icon of cinema stepping into serialized television for the first time in his long career. But behind the surface, the process of creating it was filled with unexpected twists, strange happenings, and trivia that makes the making of the show almost as entertaining as the show itself. It begins with Stallone himself, the most unusual element of all. For decades, he had been the embodiment of cinematic myth, Rocky Balboa, the underdog-made legend, John Rambo, the soldier who could outlast hell. To think of him in television, in a serialized drama where character arcs unfurl slowly rather than in cinematic bursts, was already strange. Stallone admitted that he was hesitant at first, skeptical of whether television could hold his interest or challenge him in new ways. But the premise hooked him immediately. The idea of playing a mobster who emerges from 25 years in prison only to be exiled to Tulsa, Oklahoma, struck him as absurd, comic, and yet deeply human. He laughed when he first read the pitch, and that laughter is what convinced him to say yes. It's rare for someone of his stature to jump mediums, but in this case, he confessed, he did it because the story felt too weird to pass up. The weirdness didn't stop there. Though the show was set in Tulsa, much of it was filmed in Oklahoma City. The choice was practical. The infrastructure, streets, and permits in Oklahoma City were more flexible, but it created one of the strangest behind-the-scenes quirks. Locals in Tulsa often tuned in only to notice storefronts or landmarks they recognized from elsewhere. The crew had gone to meticulous lengths to make Oklahoma City streets resemble Tulsa, even importing signage and props from local Tulsa businesses, but eagle-eyed viewers often caught the sleight of hand. Stallone himself joked during press tours that half of Tulsa looks suspiciously like Oklahoma City now. The production also had to grapple with Oklahoma's unpredictable weather. Anyone who has lived there knows storms can whip out of nowhere, bringing torrential rain or gusts of wind that seem capable of ripping the sky apart. The crew quickly learned this lesson when a violent windstorm nearly tore through their set, toppling lights and scattering equipment. Crew members clung to rigs, holding them upright while Stallone, unfazed, kept delivering his lines until the director called cut. Later, he teased. And then there were the animals. Filming on location meant unexpected visitors, especially strays. Dogs wandered into frames often, sometimes disrupting scenes, sometimes simply lying in the background like they belonged there. During one emotional monologue, Stallone was interrupted by a stray mutt who ambled up, sniffed at his leg, and sat beside him. Rather than break character, Stallone placed a hand on the dog's head and kept going, improvising the moment as if the animal had always been meant to be there. The director ultimately cut the scene, but among the crew, it was celebrated as a strange kind of magic. The dog, later adopted by a crew member, was nicknamed Dwight's dog, and occasionally brought back to set. The suits Stallone wore became their own odd trivia point. Tailored in New York and Italy, they were far too flashy for the streets of Tulsa or Oklahoma City. Locals laughed when they saw him strutting in pinstripes and silk ties in neighborhoods where denim and boots ruled. Stallone embraced the absurdity. The suit is his armor, he said, insisting on wearing them even when directors suggested casual alternatives. This decision made for striking images, a gangster in gleaming pinstripes walking through sun-baked streets, looking as out of place as a wolf in a field of cattle. One of the strangest recurring problems was Stallone's relationship with technology. Like his character Dwight, Stallone is not particularly tech-savvy. Crew members joked that scenes of him fumbling with smartphones required little acting, as Stallone often struggled with the devices himself. In fact, during one shoot, he accidentally called someone mid-scene while trying to reset the phone prop. Rather than reshoot immediately, the director allowed the moment to continue, thinking it added authenticity to Dwight's confusion with modern life. Stallone's improvisations around these mistakes ended up making the final cut, proof that accidents often create the most memorable details. Improvisation, in fact, was a hallmark of the production. Stallone, famous for rewriting and reshaping dialogue throughout his career, frequently ignored the script. He would deliver lines in ways that amused him, often throwing in humor the writers hadn't anticipated. Directors admitted that nearly a third of his dialogue was improvised or tweaked on the spot. One of the show's most quoted lines, where Dwight grumbles about not understanding apps and "these kids with their digital wallets," was entirely Stallone's invention. Castmates often had to stifle laughter during takes, knowing that what came out of his mouth could change with every run. The casting of locals added further oddity. Oklahoma City and Tulsa residents were hired as extras, and their naturalism gave the show authenticity. But not all adapted easily. Some extras, starstruck by Stallone, froze during scenes, unable to walk or speak naturally. Others attempted to interact with him mid-take, thinking their lines were part of the script. Stallone, ever the professional, rolled with it, sometimes improvising dialogue to cover the interruptions. Directors would cut afterward, laughing at the chaos, but many remarked that Stallone's patience kept the production moving smoothly despite these hiccups. And then there was the marijuana dispensary set, which became an attraction in its own right. Locals who didn't realize it was a prop shop tried to make purchases during downtime. Security had to turn away would-be customers who thought they had stumbled upon a real dispensary. The crew found this so funny that they considered selling coffee or snacks out of the fake storefront just to appease curious passers-by. Stallone, laughing at the absurdity, suggested they should keep the hustle alive and open an actual dispensary on the side. One of the strangest cultural clashes came from filming in a state with such strong identity. Some local businesses refused permission to shoot, declaring they didn't want their establishments associated with mobsters or crime. One diner famously declined, saying, "Gangsters don't belong in my cafe." The refusal forced the crew to reimagine the scene elsewhere, but the story lingered as an example of how reality sometimes pushes back against fiction. Superstitions also colored the production. Crew members reported eerie feelings while filming near the Greenwood District, the historic site tied to the tragic 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Equipment malfunctioned inexplicably, batteries drained too quickly, lights flickered without cause. Whether coincidence or not, the crew spoke of these occurrences in hushed tones, treating the location with reverence. Some said it felt as though the weight of history itself pressed upon them, a reminder that fiction was being crafted on land that had lived through real, unspeakable violence. Stallone's interactions with fans during downtime added more peculiar stories. He was swarmed constantly for photos, but one encounter stood out. An elderly woman approached him, not to praise his movies, but to ask for help finding her grandson a job. Stallone, touched, spoke with the young man and later arranged for him to be hired as a production assistant. The young man's career in film began that day, an unexpected ripple from an encounter no one could have scripted. Another trivia fact: Stallone's work ethic clashed with television's breakneck pace. Used to the slower rhythm of film, he found the schedule exhausting. "It's like going 12 rounds every day," he said in interviews. Crew members noted that despite the fatigue, Stallone thrived, pushing through long hours and even encouraging younger actors by telling them stories from his decades in Hollywood. His resilience impressed everyone, but he often joked about feeling like Rocky in retirement, trying to fight again. The reception of the show added its own strangeness. Even before the season finished airing, it was renewed for another, the numbers exceeding expectations. Stallone was stunned by the response, admitting that he hadn't expected audiences to embrace it so passionately. Fans created memes imagining Dwight meeting characters from Yellowstone, placing him in cowboy hats or joking about him running a ranch. The speculation grew so intense that Paramount had to clarify that no crossover was planned. But the sheer volume of fan creativity revealed just how quickly the show had embedded itself in popular culture. The strangest truth of all, however, may be how closely the making of the series mirrored the story it told. Just as Dwight, the aging mobster, finds himself out of place in Tulsa but slowly builds a life there, so too did Stallone, the Hollywood giant, find himself in Oklahoma, adapting to storms, strays, skeptical locals, and relentless schedules. Just as Dwight carves belonging in strange soil, so too did the crew, slowly earning the acceptance of communities wary of Hollywood intrusion. The parallels were uncanny. Stallone himself acknowledged it, saying, "Dwight and I, we were both fish out of water. We both had to figure out how to survive in Tulsa." So when one looks at the strangest facts of Tulsa King, they are more than trivia. They are reflections of the story itself, an icon stepping into unfamiliar territory, strange accidents transforming into authenticity, history pressing against fiction, and resilience carrying the day. The windstorms, the stray dogs, the diner refusals, the improvised dialogue, the superstitions, the grandmother asking for her grandson's future, these are not just oddities. They are part of the larger fabric of the show, reminders that cinema and television are never just stories told but stories lived. And perhaps that is the most fascinating truth of all, that behind the suits and the mob drama and the violence on screen, there was another drama unfolding quietly. A drama of adaptation, of resilience, of humor, of history, of community. A drama where Stallone himself became Dwight in spirit, navigating storms both literal and metaphorical, carving out something lasting in a place that seemed at first to resist him. The strangeness, then, wasn't distraction. It was essence. It made the story richer, the production more human, and the finished work resonate all the more deeply. When Tulsa King arrived in 2022, it was more than just another crime drama to join the crowded field of mafia-inspired tales. It carried with it the shadow of a legacy, the presence of Sylvester Stallone in his first ever major television role, and the fingerprints of Taylor Sheridan, whose growing empire of character-driven, morally complex shows like Yellowstone and Mayor of Kingstown had already reshaped the landscape of modern television. But unlike the sprawling ranches of Montana or the grim prisons of Michigan, Tulsa King found its home in a city that had rarely been depicted as the backdrop for crime sagas: Tulsa, Oklahoma. This geographical displacement became one of its defining traits, a symbol of the story's central tension, an old-world gangster trying to breathe in a new world he barely understands. At the heart of this series lies Dwight, the General Manfredi, a man who has given 25 years of his life to prison, shouldering the weight of loyalty to the mob, only to discover that loyalty has no currency when he is finally set free. The opening act itself serves as the first critical moment in the series, one that reverberates throughout every subsequent scene. Dwight steps out of prison gates expecting recognition, reward, and perhaps a seat at the table once again. Instead, he is cast aside, exiled from New York, and sent to Tulsa like a relic being placed in storage. This event doesn't just spark the story, it encapsulates the thematic skeleton of the entire show. The world has moved on, leaving Dwight stranded somewhere between nostalgia and obsolescence. From a critical standpoint, this decision to relocate the mafia narrative away from its traditional centers of power is both symbolic and subversive. Sheridan and Terrence Winter, who wrote The Sopranos, understood that the fish-out-of-water premise wasn't merely a comedic engine, it was a lens through which American cultural change could be examined. Tulsa itself becomes a character, a stage upon which Dwight tries to graft an old system of rules onto a land shaped by different rhythms. This clash fuels both the humor and the tragedy of the narrative. One of the early pivotal events that draws attention is Dwight's first attempt at asserting control in Tulsa. He walks into a dispensary run by Bodhi, a soft-spoken millennial whose understanding of business, technology, and legality is utterly alien to Dwight's old-world methods. Yet within minutes, Dwight strong-arms him, demands tribute, and transforms the dispensary into the nucleus of his new criminal enterprise. From a surface-level perspective, the scene plays as a humorous display of power, a 70-something mobster intimidating a man half his age who is armed only with digital savvy and idealistic notions of legality. But from a critical lens, this scene represents the central conflict of the series. Tradition confronting modernity, brute force colliding with systemic change. The dispensary is legal, transparent, and embraced by the state. Dwight's presence turns it into something else entirely, almost dragging it backward into shadows it had just escaped. Critics have noted that this single moment reveals the ambivalence of the series toward its protagonist. We are invited to laugh at Dwight's audacity, to root for his raw charisma, but we are also unsettled by how easily he corrupts something that was functioning without him. It raises the question, is Dwight truly rebuilding a kingdom, or is he merely infecting new ground with the rot of an old one? The series gains further momentum with Dwight's attempt to build unlikely alliances. His interactions with Mitch, the bar owner, and Tyson, the young driver who idolizes him, serve as narrative milestones. Tyson's decision to work for Dwight is particularly critical. On the surface, it appears to be a standard trope. The old gangster takes a young apprentice under his wing. But Tyson is not a street kid. He comes from a middle-class background, with parents who want him to avoid danger. His attraction to Dwight is therefore more psychological than economic. He craves the sense of belonging, purpose, and rebellion that Dwight embodies. From a critical perspective, Tyson's arc is less about mentorship and more about the allure of outlaw glamour in a society that often feels suffocatingly structured. Dwight becomes a myth in Tyson's eyes, a symbol of freedom against a world of rules. This dynamic reflects one of the timeless themes of gangster narratives, the dangerous magnetism of power, even when it is destructive. The show's treatment of violence provides another crucial area for analysis. Unlike many modern crime dramas that lean into graphic brutality, Tulsa King often frames violence through Dwight's almost old-fashioned lens. His attacks are swift, personal, and rooted in a code. When he assaults a biker gang member in broad daylight, it is not merely to send a message but to remind everyone, viewers included, that he operates on a currency of respect and fear. Critics have debated whether these sequences glorify Dwight or expose the futility of his methods. Perhaps one of the most poignant events in the series is Dwight's attempt to reconnect with his estranged daughter, Tina. After decades in prison, he emerges to find a daughter who has grown without him, a family life that never included him, and wounds that cannot be easily mended. The emotional resonance of these scenes stands in sharp contrast to the swagger of his criminal endeavors. Tina represents the cost of Dwight's loyalty to the mob, the personal sacrifice that is too large to repair. Critics have emphasized that these father-daughter moments ground the series, preventing it from drifting into caricature or comedy alone. They provide the emotional spine, the reminder that beneath the bravado is a man grappling with irretrievable loss. Thematically, it asks whether redemption is even possible when the past has claimed so much. As Dwight's empire grows, so too does the opposition. The arrival of rival gangs, corrupt officials, and the looming shadow of his old mob connections reasserts the inevitability of conflict. The bikers, in particular, embody the new breed of outlaw, less polished, more chaotic, and deeply territorial. Their clashes with Dwight are not merely plot devices but symbolic battles between the old order and the new. Critics have observed how these confrontations highlight Dwight's precarious position. He is powerful enough to command fear but isolated enough to be vulnerable. His exile from New York means he lacks the institutional backing that once secured his dominance. In Tulsa, he is both king and pawn, sovereign and outcast. One of the most critical turning points arrives when Dwight begins to question the very loyalty that once defined him. Betrayal emerges as a recurring motif, betrayal by his mob family, by those who fail to recognize his sacrifices, and by the changing world itself. This thematic thread resonates deeply in a postmodern context, where audiences have grown weary of romanticized loyalty in gangster tales. Unlike The Godfather or Goodfellas, which often lingered on the glamour of loyalty before unraveling it, Tulsa King places its collapse at the very center. Dwight's journey is less about climbing to power and more about realizing the futility of what he once believed in. From a reception standpoint, critics have been divided on the series' tonal balance. Some have praised its blend of humor, drama, and action as a refreshing reinvention of the gangster genre. Others have criticized it for wavering between satire and sincerity, unsure of whether it wants us to laugh at Dwight or mourn him. Yet even within this division lies the show's impact. It provokes discourse, invites reflection, and refuses to settle neatly into one category. That ambiguity is its strength. Thematically, Tulsa King resonates because it mirrors broader societal anxieties. Dwight is not just a man out of prison, he is a metaphor for generations struggling to adapt to a rapidly evolving world. Technology, legality, and culture have shifted so dramatically that his very identity feels endangered. In Dwight's stubbornness, audiences recognize their own resistance to change. In his occasional adaptability, they glimpse hope. This duality makes the series more than entertainment. It becomes a meditation on time, legacy, and survival. Perhaps the most profound perspective on the show comes from its refusal to present Dwight as a simple hero or villain. He is charming and brutal, loyal and selfish, wise and hopelessly outdated. By placing such a contradictory figure at the center, the series taps into a deeper truth about human nature. We are all contradictions, shaped by our past, trying to find relevance in an ever-changing present. When the season closes with the weight of betrayal and the fragility of Dwight's empire laid bare, the audience is left not with a sense of triumph but with a lingering question: was any of it worth it? That is the critical resonance of Tulsa King. It is not about whether Dwight succeeds in Tulsa, it is about what his struggle says about us. His empire is a mirror, reflecting our own battles with relevance, loyalty, and the passage of time. And so, in tracing the significant events, the exile, the dispensary takeover, the forging of unlikely alliances, the clashes with rival gangs, the attempts at reconciliation with family, and the eventual crumbling of trust, we see a tapestry woven with humor, violence, and melancholy. Each event is not just a plot point but a fragment of a larger meditation on belonging in a world that has no place for you anymore. This is why Tulsa King endures as more than a curiosity in Stallone's career. It is a story that invites us to laugh, to recoil, to question, and to mourn all at once. Its critical weight lies not in its resolution but in its contradictions. Just like Dwight Manfredi, it refuses to be easily categorized, lingering in the shadows between comedy and tragedy, past and present, loyalty and betrayal. When a project like Tulsa King emerges, there's always more to the story than what plays out on screen. The series exists not just as a fictional narrative, but also as a living, breathing creation shaped by countless choices, risks, and unseen efforts. The production itself is a story of its own, one filled with experiments, unexpected challenges, and the unique energy that comes from combining a veteran star with a fresh environment. To understand Tulsa King fully, it's worth slipping behind the curtain and walking through the many moments that brought this crime saga to life. The very inception of the show carried with it the weight of two worlds colliding. On one side stood Taylor Sheridan, the creative force whose recent streak of projects had proven him a magnet for audiences craving grit and grounded drama. On the other was Terrence Winter, whose name carried the resonance of The Sopranos and Boardwalk Empire, series that had defined the vocabulary of modern television crime storytelling. When Sheridan conceived of Tulsa King, he was expanding his growing empire, but he also wanted to explore something new, something that didn't unfold in Montana ranches or political war zones. Instead, he proposed an exile story set in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It wasn't just a change of location, it was a thematic pivot. The challenge was not only to create a compelling gangster saga, but to do it with a city that wasn't typically associated with organized crime. Finding the right star was another critical turning point. Sylvester Stallone had never led a television series before, despite decades of dominating cinema with franchises like Rocky and Rambo. The pitch that reached him was bold: an aging gangster, discarded by his mob family, forced to rebuild his life in an unfamiliar place. Stallone was intrigued, but the idea of doing episodic television came with risks. He had built his career on films, where he could control the arc of his characters tightly. A series meant longer commitment, longer hours, and a character who would evolve in real time. But Stallone was also searching for a new chapter, a chance to expand beyond the roles audiences always associated him with. That tension, between comfort and challenge, echoes Dwight's own narrative, making the casting itself a piece of poetic symmetry. Once Stallone was on board, the tone of the series began to crystallize. His natural charisma, gravelly delivery, and physical presence shaped the writing. Scenes that may have read one way on the page took on new dimensions when filtered through his cadence. Behind the scenes, crew members noted how Stallone infused Dwight with both menace and warmth, often improvising small gestures or lines that revealed the contradictions of the character. Production assistants recalled moments where Stallone, between takes, would offer notes drawn from his own decades of filmmaking, helping shape camera angles or adjust timing to maximize the impact of a scene. His dual role as actor and veteran storyteller lent the set a sense of mentorship, as though everyone was part of a classroom in cinematic craft. The choice to film in Oklahoma wasn't just symbolic, it brought with it logistical hurdles and unexpected delights. Tulsa had rarely been a television hub, which meant the production team had to build much of their infrastructure from scratch. Crews had to adapt to the quirks of the city, from unpredictable weather to securing locations that hadn't been used in dozens of productions before. But that freshness also became a strength. Directors remarked that every alleyway, bar, and street corner felt untouched, like raw canvas waiting for paint. Unlike New York or Los Angeles, where film crews often work in a carousel of recycled backdrops, Tulsa offered authenticity, a city that could breathe as itself rather than standing in for somewhere else. Locals became part of the process, too. Stories circulated of residents peeking curiously at Stallone striding down familiar streets, their everyday routines suddenly interrupted by cinematic spectacle. Some were even recruited as extras, their presence grounding the show in a lived reality. Crew members spoke fondly of Tulsa's hospitality, from diners that kept late hours for production staff to small businesses eager to feature in the background. The city's character bled into the final product, a collaboration between fiction and place. One of the funnier anecdotes from production involved Stallone's first scene at the dispensary. The crew had meticulously prepared the set, filling it with realistic details. Jars of cannabis, neon signs, digital tablets for transactions. Yet Stallone, unfamiliar with the aesthetics of modern dispensaries, reportedly quipped, "It looks more like an Apple store than a crime front." The line became an inside joke on set, a reminder of the show's central tension between old-school and new-school worlds. Costume design also played a pivotal role in shaping Dwight's identity. Wardrobe supervisors described how Stallone worked closely with them to strike a balance between timeless mobster fashion and subtle nods to his displacement. His suits were sharp but slightly outdated, his shoes polished but not flashy. The goal was to make him look like a man who had frozen in time 2 decades earlier, walking into a world that had kept moving. Every button, cufflink, and tie was chosen with intention, telling a story even before Dwight spoke a word. Cinematography became another layer of storytelling. Directors of photography leaned into contrasts, wide shots that emphasized Dwight's smallness in sprawling Tulsa landscapes, followed by tight close-ups that captured the grit of his expressions. Behind the scenes, gaffers and lighting teams experimented with natural light, often using the Oklahoma sun to cast golden, almost nostalgic hues across scenes. These choices weren't accidental, they mirrored Dwight's longing for a past that glowed brighter in memory than in reality. Of course, no production is without its challenges. Filming schedules were grueling, with long days and shifting weather forcing the crew into improvisation. One storm reportedly delayed shooting for days, requiring sets to be rebuilt and schedules rearranged. Yet these difficulties forged camaraderie. Cast and crew bonded over shared frustrations and triumphs, often gathering after shoots to swap stories and decompress. Stallone, known for his rigorous discipline, inspired many younger actors with his tireless energy. Even at 75, he often insisted on doing multiple takes, seeking to refine his performance until it felt authentic. One behind-the-scenes story that crew members cherished involved a bar fight sequence. Choreographers had carefully planned the movements, ensuring safety while maintaining realism. But Stallone, drawing on his action film background, suggested tweaks on the spot, adjusting the flow to emphasize Dwight's brute efficiency. After the take, one stunt performer reportedly joked, "I just got directed in a bar fight by Rocky Balboa, life complete." These spontaneous moments added layers of authenticity to the action sequences, bridging Stallone's cinematic past with his television present. The production also leaned heavily on music to craft its tone. Music supervisors described the challenge of blending classic rock and modern country influences, creating a soundscape that reflected both Dwight's nostalgia and Tulsa's cultural identity. Behind closed doors, playlists circulated among the cast, with songs proposed for various moods. Stallone himself reportedly suggested tracks that reminded him of his youth, infusing the soundtrack with personal echoes. Editing played its part in shaping the balance of humor and menace. Early cuts leaned too heavily on Dwight's intimidation, but producers realized the comedy of his bewilderment in modern settings was equally vital. Editors fine-tuned scenes, letting silences linger just long enough for awkward humor to land, or cutting sharply to highlight sudden bursts of violence. This rhythm became the show's heartbeat, a pulse that carried through every episode. Fun facts sprinkle the production like hidden treasures. For example, Stallone insisted on rewriting certain lines himself, adding the kind of quirky phrasing that had long been his signature. In one scene, when Dwight mocks a character's over-reliance on technology, the line had originally been more generic. Stallone altered it to reference old payphones, a nod to his own nostalgia. Similarly, props often carried Easter eggs, books stacked in the background that referenced classic crime novels, or graffiti that slyly hinted at mob history. Attentive viewers who paused frames could find layers of meaning beyond the surface action. The crew also enjoyed the rare luxury of working with a lead actor who had lived through decades of Hollywood history. Stallone often shared stories between takes, recounting moments from Rocky's scrappy production or his experiences on blockbuster sets in the 1980s. Younger cast members, many of whom had grown up watching his films, described the surreal feeling of being both co-workers and students. These moments didn't just lighten the mood, they created an environment where history and present converged, much like Dwight's own struggle in the narrative. As the show neared completion, the buzz around it grew. Trailers emphasized Stallone's larger-than-life presence, but what struck early viewers was the show's ability to balance humor, pathos, and grit. Behind the scenes, there was a sense of quiet satisfaction. The risks had paid off, an unconventional location, a veteran star's first foray into television, and a narrative that dared to mix tones had all coalesced into something fresh. And yet, even as success seemed assured, the crew reflected on the fragile magic of it all. They knew that what audiences would see was only a fraction of the story. Behind every frame was an army of people, countless hours, and an unspoken belief that they were building something more than just another crime drama. They were crafting a bridge, between cinema and television, between past and present, between tradition and reinvention. The story of Tulsa King's production is not merely one of logistics and schedules. It is a tale of collaboration, risk, and reinvention. It is the story of a Hollywood legend finding new ground, of a city embracing its role as a stage, and of a crew discovering humor and humanity in the midst of grit. Every behind-the-scenes anecdote, every costume choice, every storm-delayed shoot contributed to a final product that resonated far beyond its expected reach. And so, the making of Tulsa King becomes a story in its own right, as layered and compelling as the fictional saga of Dwight Manfredi. It reminds us that the screen is only the surface. The real drama often unfolds just out of sight, in the moments when art, craft, and chance collide. Tulsa is not the kind of place one usually expects to find in the mythology of gangsters. It is not New York, with its looming skyscrapers, smoky backrooms, and historic mafia enclaves. It is not Chicago, drenched in Prohibition-era lore, or Los Angeles, with its neon-glossy crime thrillers. Tulsa, Oklahoma, exists almost as a blank page in the canon of organized crime storytelling, and that blankness is precisely what makes it so compelling. When Tulsa King unfolds, it immediately transforms the city from a backdrop into a living, breathing character. The setting does not simply contain the story, it shapes every choice, every mood, and every confrontation. To trace the series is to trace how its world molds Dwight Manfredi and how cinematography crafts that world into something mythic. The opening sequence, Dwight stepping out of prison and staring into a horizon no longer familiar, plants the seed for everything that follows. Though the prison itself is not in Tulsa, the sense of exile carries into his arrival. When Dwight is banished from New York and shipped to Oklahoma, the series doesn't just displace a man, it displaces a culture. Tulsa becomes an alien landscape, a frontier that Dwight must claim. His old-world sophistication and code of loyalty collide with a geography shaped by wide skies, sprawling roads, and unassuming storefronts. Cinematically, the contrast is stark. Gone are the tight, shadowy corridors of East Coast mob dramas, replaced instead by sunlight-drenched expanses and small-town facades. The camera lingers on these differences, almost reveling in the irony of an old-school mobster striding into wide-open spaces. One of the earliest and most memorable locations is the cannabis dispensary. In many ways, it serves as the nucleus of Dwight's new empire. The building itself, bright, modern, and outfitted with glass cases and digital point-of-sale systems, is nothing like the smoky backroom bars or underground clubs where mobsters traditionally ply their trade. When Dwight first walks into Bodie's dispensary, the cinematography emphasizes the clinical sterility of the place. Bright lighting, sleek shelves, colorful jars. Yet when Dwight takes control, the tone shifts. Shadows lengthen, the camera lowers its angle, and suddenly this clean storefront feels more like contested territory. The juxtaposition between modern legality and Dwight's ancient rituals of extortion is not only thematic but visual, a clash of palettes that defines the series' style. Bars, too, become vital spaces. Mitch's bar, dimly lit and layered with history, feels like a pocket of old America preserved against the tide of change. It's in these settings that Dwight finds kinship, negotiating alliances and carving out his fragile dominion. Cinematographers play with warm lighting in the bar, bathing scenes in amber glows that contrast with the harsh fluorescence of the dispensary. This contrast reflects Dwight's dual existence. On one side, the cold reality of modern enterprise. On the other, the nostalgic warmth of camaraderie, alcohol, and shared rebellion. The streets of Tulsa themselves play almost as supporting characters. Unlike the tightly packed neighborhoods of New York, Tulsa's layout is defined by broad roads, gas stations, strip malls, and suburban homes. Directors lean into wide shots that emphasize emptiness, often framing Dwight as a lone figure against the expanse. There is humor in these shots. A man who once commanded fear in crowded cities now struts past car washes and supermarkets, but there is also melancholy. The environment constantly reminds him that his empire is fragile, cobbled together in a place that does not recognize his rituals. Critics noted how these wide compositions evoke both westerns and outsider tales, situating Tulsa King in a cinematic lineage beyond crime dramas. The homes and neighborhoods also provide glimpses into the lives Dwight disrupts. Tyson's suburban home, for instance, is bathed in natural light, a sharp contrast to the darker interiors Dwight occupies. When Dwight enters Tyson's world, the camera emphasizes the discomfort, the gangster seated awkwardly at a middle-class dinner table, framed by family portraits and pastel walls. These visual choices highlight the cultural divide, the intrusion of a man defined by violence into the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. Every setting tells a story before the dialogue even begins. But Tulsa is not only a space of awkward comedy. The city's rougher corners, the biker bars, run-down motels, and industrial yards, remind us that beneath the veneer of any American town lies its shadows. The cinematography often shifts in these locations, trading the warm hues for colder tones, harsh blues and grays that signal danger. The biker gang's presence is framed through these environments, their chaos embodied in flashing neon signs, sticky floors, and metal-charged atmospheres. These spaces feel alive with menace, the camera often handheld, creating jittery tension as Dwight confronts them. One particularly striking element of the show's visual language is its use of Tulsa's skyline and natural light. The city, while not as iconic as New York or Los Angeles, becomes mythologized through lensing. Sunsets stretch across wide skies, casting long shadows that mirror Dwight's own elongated legacy. These spaces feel alive with menace, the camera often handheld, creating jittery tension as Dwight confronts them. One particularly striking element of the show's visual language is its use of Tulsa's skyline and natural light. The city, while not as iconic as New York or Los Angeles, becomes mythologized through lensing. Sunsets stretch across wide skies, casting long shadows that mirror Dwight's own elongated legacy. Dusk is a recurring motif, moments of transition where colors bleed into one another, signaling Dwight's own struggle to reconcile past and present. The cinematographers seem to relish these golden hours, letting scenes breathe in long takes, where silence and space are as powerful as dialogue. Cars, too, become part of the setting's visual vocabulary. Dwight's preference for old-fashioned vehicles stands out against the backdrop of SUVs and trucks populating Tulsa. Each time he steps into a car, the frame lingers, reminding us of his refusal to adapt. The roads themselves, long and stretching endlessly, emphasize both opportunity and isolation. Dwight is free, unbound by New York's claustrophobic streets, but he is also exposed, a solitary figure in a land where no one owes him respect. Cinematographers further exploit contrasts in interior design. Tina's home, when Dwight finally reconnects with her, is framed with domestic warmth, soft lighting, family photos, toys scattered in corners. Yet Dwight, in his dark suits, feels visually out of place. The mise-en scene underscores the emotional chasm between father and daughter, the cost of years spent behind bars. These choices are subtle but deeply effective, telling us everything we need to know about Dwight's alienation without heavy exposition. The show also experiments with tone through framing. When Dwight exerts control, such as in his early confrontation with Bodie, the camera often shoots from below, lending him an imposing presence. But in moments of vulnerability, particularly with Tina, the angle shifts upward, making Dwight seem small, a man dwarfed by forces beyond his control. This dynamic visual grammar ensures that viewers not only hear Dwight's struggles but feel them. Humor finds its way into the cinematography as well. In scenes where Dwight grapples with modern technology, smartphones, apps, or credit cards, the camera often exaggerates his bewilderment. Tight close-ups on his furrowed brows, lingering cuts on glowing screens, and deliberate pacing turn these mundane interactions into moments of comedy. The setting of modern Tulsa, with its tech-savvy culture, becomes an ongoing punchline, one that the cinematography amplifies with visual irony. One cannot ignore the role of Tulsa itself as an atmosphere. The city has scars, reminders of its history, including the shadow of the 1921 race massacre, which lingers in cultural memory. While the show doesn't explicitly dive into this history, its setting cannot be detached from it. The wide shots of downtown, the juxtaposition of old brick buildings with gleaming new ones, carry unspoken layers of tension between past and progress. Dwight's arrival, with his outdated codes and archaic notions of loyalty, mirrors the city's own negotiation with its identity. The editing rhythm complements the visual storytelling. Action scenes unfold with sharp, rapid cuts that heighten tension, while dialogue-heavy moments often stretch in long takes, allowing actors' expressions and the weight of setting to dominate. This ebb and flow of pacing mirrors Dwight's life, bursts of violent assertion punctuating long stretches of adjustment and reflection. Sound design enhances the atmosphere of settings. Bars hum with low conversations and clinking glasses, dispensaries buzz with sterile hums, and open roads echo with the steady hum of engines. These layers build immersion, grounding the audience in Tulsa's textures. The sound of boots on concrete, doors creaking open, or the distant howl of wind often punctuates silence, adding weight to Dwight's contemplative moments. Thematic resonance emerges directly from these cinematic choices. Tulsa, with its open skies and unfamiliar terrain, becomes a metaphor for exile and rebirth. Cinematography insists on contrasts between light and shadow, warmth and sterility, intimacy and isolation. Dwight's story is not just told through dialogue and plot, but through the way his figure is constantly framed against the city, sometimes in dominance, often in displacement. In the final episodes, as Dwight's fragile empire begins to wobble under betrayal and external pressures, the cinematography shifts subtly darker. Nights stretch longer, shadows creep further, and the warm hues of earlier alliances give way to cooler, starker palettes. Tulsa itself seems to close in, no longer offering openness but reminding Dwight of the dangers lurking in every corner. And so, the setting of Tulsa King is not incidental, it is essential. Tulsa becomes Dwight's adversary and his ally, a canvas upon which his contradictions are painted. Through careful cinematography, the show transforms strip malls into battlegrounds, diners into confessionals, and sunsets into elegies. The visual elements never just decorate the story, they tell it, adding layers of irony, melancholy, and resonance. The true genius of Tulsa King lies in this. By choosing Tulsa, by shooting it with reverence and irony, the series redefines what a gangster tale can look like. No longer confined to the crowded boroughs of New York, the genre breathes new air, finding fresh tension in wide roads and unfamiliar landscapes. The cinematic elements craft a mood that is both humorous and tragic, both nostalgic and contemporary, echoing Dwight Manfredi's own fractured existence. In every frame, we feel the weight of place, the burden of exile, and the beauty of reinvention. It is here, in the interplay of setting and cinematic craft, that Tulsa King achieves its most enduring power. The city becomes myth, the camera becomes conscience, and the story becomes not only Dwight's but Tulsa's,